Thank you, Mariano. Thank you for the invitation to come here to speak to this audience today. We'll just get a PowerPoint running, and there it is. We need some variety. It's been a long day, and it was an excellent lunch. So see if we can bring some variety to keep the audience awake. My topic is trends in areas of peace, conflict, and conflict resolution. As Mariano pointed out, seemingly a very different topic, unconnected from what Monica just talked about. But I do think, as I proceed, that you will see that there are some overlaps. I'm going to go to a totally different approach. I'm going to base this very much on statistical work that's been done at PRIO, my own institute, and elsewhere on the trends when it comes to conflicts in the world, and use that as a platform for speculating as to where we stand at the present and where we may be moving forward. This is a book that very recently came out, and of course, as always, being the director of PRIO, I'm very happy when I see the work of my colleagues being cited. It is no less than 800 pages volume on how it is that the world has become a more peaceful place. Now, that claim in itself may come as some of a surprise to many of you. I will try to substantiate it, and you're certainly welcome to challenge me as we move into the discussion. The book is pretty fresh off the press, just a couple of months ago, and it's been quite widely debated also in the international press. We have now formal links with Steven Pinker, but we're happy that he's actually coming to lecture at our institute just over Christmas. This is a graph that I often start out with. This is a graph that displays the number of conflicts that we have in the world in the period from the Second World War until the present. The gray shaded area is the number of internal conflicts. The dark area at the bottom is the number of conflicts between states. And you will certainly see that there has been a significant decline in the number of conflicts over the few past years. Well, over the few past decades, I should say, past couple of decades. But also that there is perhaps an increase that we are seeing in the past few years. Now, the definition of conflict matters here, of course, and since this is an attempt to be statistically consistent over time, we have had to operate with a fairly strict definition, which is conflicts where the state is one of the parties or both parties, and where at least 25 people are killed in battle-related activities in any given year. So to get on to these statistics, you will have to have an incompatibility between a state and some other actor in which 25 people are killed. Definitions can always be disputed. Quite interestingly, if you look at the number of international conflicts, the statistics is quite dramatic. Again, we go back to the Second World War, and we see that there have been long periods with quite a high number of armed conflict between states. Sorry, it's a little hard for me to see the figures on the monitors I have in front of me, including the one I have in back, in fact. But we see that for long periods there have been in the range of 6 to 8 international conflicts between states in any given year, but that in recent years we've hardly had any armed conflict that involves states on both sides of the line. Perhaps more interestingly is the number of battle deaths, and here I think we go to the core also of Steven Pinker's argument. This is again based on a data set that's been developed at PRIO based on news reporting, and it's quite ambitiously going all the way back to the 1900. And of course what you see here immediately is the enormous impact of the two world wars. But let's zoom in on the period after the Second World War, where the numbers start falling significantly. But we do see that it's really hard to read this from where I stand. I hope you can read it better than I can. But you do see a couple of periods here. You do see a period around about 1950, early 50s, where there were quite high numbers of people killed in war. Korea was important here, of course. You do see a period in the 60s with the wars in Indochina. And you also see in the 1980s the wars in Iran and Iraq, between Iran and Iraq, which is the blue shade at the bottom there, as well as the war in Afghanistan, having contributed to quite high number of people killed in direct battle. And again, you see that the numbers have been significantly less in recent years. Let's zoom in on the past few years. And here, again, as I indicated, when it came to the number of conflict, you also see a slight increase in the number of people being killed in war. One would perhaps believe from a superficial reading of the news from Iraq and Afghanistan that the figures would be much more dramatic. And as somebody who is deeply concerned with those countries, not the least with Afghanistan, I don't want to belittle the number of people being killed in those conflicts. But if we take a sweeping historical perspective, it is nonetheless comparatively fairly limited. Here is a map of the area of the countries that have been affected by, and again I use the same definition of conflict, by conflict in the numbers in the years 2006 to 2008. And of course it's a fairly depressing map because seemingly much of the globe is covered by conflict. This is one of the reasons why in recent years we have started moving into different methodologies by which we are able to restrict the areas affected by conflict. If at this map you look at Russia, for example, you of course get the impression that all of Russia is affected by conflict, whereas in fact most of us would know that the area of Russia that's affected by conflict is mainly the Caucasus. And that brings us to a map which is at least somewhat more optimistic in the message that it conveys. And this is important if you're working on it statistically, because, for example, if you want to look at, to take one example, the correlation between conflict in a country and its dependence on natural resources, then the prior map would immediately give you the impression that Russia, as a country dependent on natural resources, something that Kennedy actually touched upon earlier today, it could indicate that there's a correlation between the two things. But once you know that the conflict is located in the Caucasus, you'd be hard put to make the argument that natural resources is at the core of these conflicts. Here we have battle deaths broken down by region, and you may immediately see that there have been tremendous variation over the years in which regions of the world have been most deeply affected by serious conflict. One question that immediately comes to mind, looking at the trend here, and the yellow area is the number of people being killed in conflicts in the Middle East and Northern Africa, is what this map would look like, what this graph would look like if we had the freshest number from the atrocities that are playing out in parts of the Middle East and North Africa as we speak, and that have been playing out over the most recent year. And that is one of the question marks that we should have with us when we look at these statistics, because we don't have statistics entirely in true time here. Number of new armed conflicts, and again, I think what we see is that there is a slight decline from, not from year to year, but a slight decline over the past 60, 65 years from the end of the Second World War to today. It's also interesting to look at this little piece of statistics, which is simply an overview of which wars have had a high number of participating states. And I think we do see something that may be interesting here in terms of a higher and higher number participating in certain conflicts. So the so-called coalition of the willing in Afghanistan, for example, here at 28 countries, but have at given times been up to 48 countries participating in one and the same war. Likewise, the war in Iraq, gathering a high number of countries. The question that raises is not a mathematical one, it's probably more of a normative one, and that is the question as to whether the use of organized armed force is increasingly being seen as an accepted part of the toolbox in fostering peace and security globally. This little graph conveys some of the same message. Here we have a graph that displays the share of states taking part in war in any given year. And we see that in recent years, more than 1/3 of the world states have actually been involved in war. And I think that underlines my points about at least raising the question as to whether we do see a normative change here. So are we moving towards a more peaceful world? Well, if you take all of the figures I presented to you at face value, that would seem to be the inevitable conclusion. I do think it is right to ask it as a question, though, rather than pose it as a conclusion. For one, it's a question of what time perspective we use on this. I have seen it here in a more than 100-year perspective. If we look at it in the perspective of the past 20 years, it's a very different picture. The late 90s were certainly more peaceful than the situation we have today, and not the least very more successful in terms of resolving conflicts, reducing the number of conflicts active at any given time for a period in the mid to late 1990s. Is the trend durable? That's much harder to respond to, of course. We simply don't know. But there is reason for concern, seeing how there has been a slight increase in the number of conflicts steadily over the past, in fact, 5 years now. And then the ultimate question, and this was the question that I was presented with, that I presented parts of this statistics in Brasilia in the spring this year, and people would say, all right, in Latin America we don't really have wars, but that doesn't mean we have violence. We have a number of other types of violence. And the question is that violence simply taking over from the types of violence that you are counting with your statistics? I think a profoundly important question. So the other kinds of violence that we could think about, the list is actually quite long, so long that I won't even take you through it. There is one-sided violence. Genocide is not counted in the statistics I just presented you with. So the genocide in Rwanda, for example, wouldn't be presented. Indirect deaths, people who die as a result of the fact that health services are breaking down, or that the road system is breaking down, so they don't make it to the hospital. So women may die giving birth simply because there is no way of getting to medical help. There is, as far as we've been able to judge, no sensible basis on which to make assessments of the number of indirect deaths. We haven't entirely given up, but it's really something we're really struggling with. Conflict between non-state actors also is not counted, and it may be that those are more and more important. We have terrorism, we have organized crime. The example of Mexico has been touched upon a couple of times earlier today. Urban violence. And finally, we have structural violence, which is a concept that was coined by one of my predecessors, Johan Galtung, referring to the type of violence that doesn't necessarily kill directly, but that represses, constrains, and so forth. So living under economic, political, and other pressures to one's fundamental rights is also a type of violence in its own right. And that violence certainly isn't counted here. So the ultimate question is whether the decline of violence that I tried to demonstrate to you really isn't a decline, but only a transformation. And I'll leave that there as a question rather than give an answer. If there is a decline of violence, though, why is there a decline? And there is certainly a decline in the number of types of conflict that I have counted with here. One thing is the end of the Cold War, where a number of protracted conflicts were suddenly able to respond to. And when we look at the fact that a number of conflicts were resolved in the 1990s, whereas fewer conflicts have been resolved in recent years, one reason for that may be the simple fact that we were picking low-hanging fruits, so to say, in the 1990s. Those conflicts who were immediately opening up to resolution when the Iron Curtain fell, whereas now the conflicts we are dealing with are protracted in a much more profound sense. There is speculation as to whether the spread of peacekeeping is an important factor. There have been strong arguments that peacekeeping is very effective. And then finally, there is the more ultimate example, the more ultimate factor of the so-called liberal peace. Is the world simply becoming a happier place due to globalization, due to the spread of the market economy, due to the spread of democratic values? These are large and profound questions, but nonetheless, there certainly are people who would argue so. Steven Pinker, who I referred to in the introduction, is somebody who would go down this direction, but he would say that all of this basically inspires, and he's a cognitive psychologist by training, would inspire a deeper understanding of each other, a type of, he would use the word empathy in that context. So the factors I'm listing here are more structural factors, but his argument would actually be that the type of intercultural understanding and respect fostered is what ultimately contributes to a more civilized world. The spread of peacekeeping has certainly been profound. If we look here at the number of UN peacekeeping operations in any given year, that is certainly quite convincing. That doesn't necessarily mean that the correlation between the spread of peacekeeping and the decline in the number of conflict is super tight. But the correlation in itself is interesting. Here, if we look at, and this is an interesting piece of statistics which we could spend much more time on than we have here, but the idea here is to use 1973 as the point of reference, and then look at statistics for domestic product per capita, for the number of international governmental organizations, for democracy, and for international trade as share of global domestic or gross domestic product globally. And what we see, quite interestingly, is that three of these curves follow each other with a slight increase from 1973 to the present, whereas the one that has a dramatic increase is international trade. And many people would use the argument, certainly in contradiction to the dependency theorists so influential in the 1960s, that international trade does foster global interdependence and therefore ultimately contributes to peace. So that brings me to the question as to whether what we see is a capitalist peace. That's a provocative term, intentionally provocative, but it is being presented with considerable force in this debate. The spread of the market economy mixed in with a strong state. Make no mistake about it, there isn't an absence of a state here. There is a fairly strong and regulatory state, as well as democracy, which perhaps means that it's more correct to refer to this as a social democratic peace. Coming from a Norwegian, that shouldn't be a surprise to you, of course. But that's probably a more appropriate term than the capitalist peace, but perhaps not as sexy as the capitalist peace. So, whereas this was the slogan of the 60s and the 70s, it may mean that the slogan of the present is this: make money, not war. So to conclude, and this is where I overlap with much of what Monica talked about in much greater depth, we do see a transformation of the international system, and it's unfolding as we speak, so I don't think we're able to say with any level of certainty exactly where that brings us. But there certainly is an end to US supremacy. Doesn't mean an end to US influence in the global system, by no means. We do see a decline of European influence, and most interestingly, and this Monica talked about, we do see the emergence of new global powers. So all in all, this results in the emergence of a more multipolar world, and a multipolar world is probably, and I think Kennedy also alluded to this morning, a more unpredictable world. This brings us also, and this is the conclusion, to some dilemmas on the overarching peace agenda. And we see some of these dilemmas in front of us if you follow the international media. They very much relate to the transforming global system that I just referred to. We see, for example, how it is that established principles of state sovereignty are challenged by international interventions. We saw this very interestingly in the discussions about intervention in Libya. We have seen the same, perhaps not with the same level of media attention, in the discussions about a possible intervention in Syria. And I do think we can say quite safely that one of the impacts of the intervention in Libya and the way that that played out is that it's going to be very, very difficult to get the emerging powers in the Security Council to go for another intervention of a similar sort. We also see a very lively debate about democracy. I included the spread of democracy in my social democratic piece, but there certainly is a strong call in many quarters for looking in a much more nuanced way at different political models, and there are even strong arguments in some quarters that democracy may not necessarily be the most conducive political system at all stages of a country's developmental path. We see similar discussions when it comes to economic liberalism, and we also see similar dilemmas when it comes to the globally emerging norm that we've had over the past 20-25 years when it comes to war criminals, manifested in the establishment of the International Criminal Court. And I do think that as we move forward, this will also come up as a quite interesting debate related to Libya. We certainly have seen traces of it. But when we get some more distance, questions will come up as to whether a system where holding war criminals responsible was balanced against other concerns, it could have been possible to resolve the Libyan situation without necessarily a full-scale war. So I do think we end up with some quite rather fundamental questions as to where the world goes forward, and not the least where the multilateral system goes. We do often in debates such as this talk about the world as if there is an emerging consensus on issues of peace and conflict. There were elements of this in Monica's discussion, and the question here is, do we really think that the transformation of the global power system will foster further consensus, or are we seeing wider disagreements? I tend to think that what we will see are wider disagreements. The example of an emerging power that Monica used in her presentation was Brazil, which seems very much committed to the seeming consensus globally on market liberalism and democracy. But we could mention other examples, such as China, just to take one, who is not necessarily equally convinced that democracy and market liberalism is the only way to foster a more peaceful world. So we have interesting times ahead of us. Thanks.